As of writing the script, Leafy has officially been banned from YouTube, with his account deleted late on Friday night. This has led to his name trending on Twitter, with thousands voicing their opinions on what this means for the future of platforms such as YouTube, who at one time prided themselves on being for freedom of expression. Before we get to this current situation, however, let me briefly summarize Calvin's controversial rise to fame on the internet. Things first took off in 2015 when he was one of the founding members of the commentary community on YouTube, a group that gave their opinions and reported on the internet in and of itself. While that idea doesn't seem that amazing now, back in 2015, this meta-analysis of internet culture was revolutionary, and Leafy's brash style and in-your-face titles and thumbnails made him rise very quickly. The problem was his content was often mean-spirited, and as seen in leaked YouTube emails, the higher-ups wanted him gone. This seemed to result in his channel being deranked behind the scenes, with his meteoric rise crashing within a month. Eventually, Leafy disappeared and went on a multi-year hiatus, but a few months back showed up again to a much more restrictive post-adpocalypse YouTube. Ethan Klein, who has admitted to disliking Leafy, questioned his ability to make content in the current landscape, which Calvin saw as a challenge. But it seems after a satirical series of videos about the streamer Pokimane, which became less and less about her as they went on, YouTube had enough and banned him for bullying, despite the fact that those he had been criticizing since his return have been rich and famous public figures. While most people are sitting around arguing if Leafy's content was good or if it's fair to call him a cyberbully, to me the bickering doesn't matter that much. The real question I want to ask today is if Leafyishere had a right to exist. If you personally don't like Leafyishere, that is perfectly understandable. But just because something at this moment in time is detested, does that mean it should be terminated? Do unruly characters have a place in online discussions? And just because they're looked down upon now, will history have a different view of the situation? These are all important questions that I feel most don't put enough thought into before flagrantly steering the ban hammer to those they disagree with. A guiding principle in much of today's society is the concept of free speech, and that no matter how unpopular of an opinion you have, you should be allowed to share it, as long as that speech doesn't impede the rights of others. Whether it be through a country's laws or YouTube community guidelines, if you start punishing people for saying something you find distasteful, there will often be repercussions for yourself when you're the one who's voicing opinions that aren't considered socially acceptable. Because that's the thing, who are you or I to say what speech should be allowed? In the past century, there have been calls to ban rock and roll music, the ideology of communism through the Red Scare, gangster rap, and violent video games, all because at a certain moment in time, people felt that those things went beyond the pale. Maybe a few years down the line, trying to suppress internet criticism will be added to that list. A misconception I often see are people that conflate the concept of free speech with the First Amendment, even though these are two completely different things. While the Constitution's First Amendment includes provisions for freedom of expression in the United States, the concept of freedom of speech is an ideology that can be applied anywhere, from TV stations, to bookstores, to performance venues, to countries, to even websites. It's all too common for people to conflate the two and act like merely stating that YouTube is a private company is some sort of valid argument in favor of online censorship. This just shows a lack of understanding of the usefulness of a free and open platform, even if Google isn't legally required to do so. That's not to say there aren't legal arguments to be made for why places like Google and Facebook should be upholding free speech on their platforms. For one, under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, they have been given unprecedented immunity from defamation lawsuits over what is said by their users on their website. Now, you might be asking why there's a provision to prevent these giant tech companies from being sued if slanderous claims are made about you on their sites. Well, the logic at the time was that these companies are merely platforms, rather than publishers, so they shouldn't be held accountable for what is being written, as they're merely allowing the public a place to speak their mind. The question is, at what point does a platform become a publisher if they have strict rules for what content they allow on the site, censor only certain people's opinions, and push content that falls in line with the agenda of the site and its owners? When do they become liable for what is said on their app if they are the ones controlling the narrative and speech coming out of it? That's where things become unclear. Section 230 does allow for websites to remove content that is excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable, whether or not such material is constitutionally protected, as long as they act in good faith. The thing is, what content is considered excessively harassing? And how do you decide if YouTube acted in good faith when removing a channel like Leafy? Clearly, I'm not a lawyer, but with how uneven social networks have been with striking down harassing content, I think there's a case to be made that if they want to have such control over what ideas are allowed on their platform, then they should no longer be protected from defamation suits. The reason I say that YouTube is uneven with how they handle censorship is because the hypocrisy becomes pretty clear when you start looking around. Let me ask you, what was the rule Leafy had broken since his comeback? He made fun of public figures on the internet. Well, I have news for you. Late night talk show hosts do the same thing every single episode in their monologue to whomever is in the headlines, and then post their public ridicule on YouTube the next day with full monetization. Night after night, they mock celebrities and politicians for the amusement of their audience. But since these shows have been on the air for decades, it appears people are more willing to give them a pass. The same thing goes for music videos. Songs involving themes of murder, being in gangs, committing crime, calling others derogatory names, and threats of violence often have hundreds of millions of views on YouTube. Back in the 90s, Pearl Clutchers said that music groups like NWA and Eminem were going to be the end of society, and that they needed to be banned, and pressured music stores to ban their records much like people do to YouTube nowadays. Because rap music has been around for a while now, the outrage has calmed down as these songs are not only just tolerated on YouTube, but often put on the trending tab and have full monetization. In the case of somebody like Eminem, many of his lyrics are directed at real people, and are 10 times more disturbing than anything Leafy has ever said in his life. Yet for some reason that's okay, and you can listen to those songs on YouTube right now. If we're being truthful, the reason people want Leafy banned is he is the current day iteration of the boogeyman who is destroying society. And you know what? Maybe that is correct. But who's to say he shouldn't be allowed to lambast the community, and those in it, just as so many provocateurs have done before him? This brings me right back to the principle of freedom of speech, which is, just because you don't like what someone is saying, it doesn't mean we shouldn't allow them to say it. But it seems many in the current landscape don't subscribe to that philosophy anymore. In the aftermath of the termination, people such as Ethan Klein started to gloat about the ban of his enemy on Twitter, then proceeded to block anyone that showed the slightest amount of support for Leafy. The most baffling thing about all this is my mere tweets in support of freedom of speech on YouTube were enough to get me unfollowed and blocked by Ethan. I must say this really bummed me out, as I've been a fan of H3H3 for the past half decade. But it seems pretty clear now that the only reason he followed and talked with me in the first place was that he hoped that I would take his side in his feud against Keemstar and Leafy, when the truth is the only opinion I have on their little war is that all sides should have the right to openly share their opinions without the fear of channel termination. The writing has been on the wall for a while now, but it seems like we're finally getting to the point where any content that's rough around the edges or pushes the limits of what's considered socially acceptable will start being banned, while millions cheer it on. I just hope they learn before it's too late that once the censorship ball starts rolling, it will continue to take down people, and then finally, it reaches you.
Je peux